Everyone knows the cult phrase sex, drugs, and rock and roll. If we change it for this video's protagonists, brothers Demetrius and Terry Flenory, then you get sex, drugs, and hip-hop. The only difference is that they traded drugs instead of using them, and they did it for millions of dollars, having built a drug network covering almost the whole of America. Though they weren't rap artists themselves, they had their own label, and within hip-hop culture they walked in the lines of many rappers, including P. Diddy and Jeezy. So if you're interested in hearing the story of probably the most iconic black gangsters of the 90s, who they even made a TV show about, then meet Black Mafia Family on the other side of the law. The future founders of the Black Mafia Family, Demetrius and Terry Flenory, were born in Detroit, Michigan. Demetrius, nicknamed Big Meech, was born on June 21, 1968, and was the firstborn in the family. A year and a half later, Terry was born. The brothers' childhood was spent in a loving atmosphere. Their family was not rich, but the parents did everything to ensure that their children did not lack anything. Meech and Terry's father, Charles Flenory, even abandoned his dream of becoming a musician for the well-being of the family, and got a job at a steel mill. After the birth of the third child in the family, a daughter Nicole, Charles Flenory began to work 2 jobs at once. In addition to working at the mill, he also worked part-time as a laborer in several local hospitals. The family was devout. The Flenory brothers' father managed to find the time in his already busy schedule to help the local church. Even after the brothers' parents divorced, they remained on good terms. But because of the pursuit of earning money, the parents could not devote much attention to their children, and so they were raised on the street. Since the 9th grade, the brothers abandoned their studies and spent all their time on the streets, appearing at school from time to time only to attend the games of the local basketball team. At first, the brothers joined the 50 Boys drug gang led by Edric Boyd. This group sold drugs mainly in the neighborhoods of southwest Detroit. It is noteworthy that Boyd's prices owed themselves to the low cost of their goods. A bag with a few grams of cocaine was sold for $50, while in other parts of the city, the same bag could go for $150 or even $200. In some sources, there is information that around those years the father of the Flenory brothers left his family for a new woman, and it was the brothers who became the main breadwinners in the family. It is known that by the mid-'80s, Meech and Terry left the 50 Boys and started dealing drugs in a major way. To do this, they contacted one of the then main drug dealers of Detroit, Rodolfo "Bolo" Moreno. If 50 Boys controlled the dark-skinned neighborhoods of the southwest side of the city, Moreno controlled the part of the southwest where mostly Hispanics lived. Bolo favored the 2 boys. In fact, he was the one who taught them their first lessons of the big-time drug trade, and eventually became their first major cocaine supplier. The Flenorys proved themselves capable students. It was known that by the late 80s, the brothers could sell up to 2 kilos of crack a week. After working with Bolo for about a year and a half, the boys realized that it was much more profitable for them to work with another local drug dealer, Harold H-Town Mills. He offered the product at lower prices. If the time that the Flenory brothers learned about drug dealing from Ed and Bolo could be compared to elementary or middle school, their partnership with Harold took them to a whole new grade level. It was a true university. In addition, shortly after meeting the Flenorys, Harold went to prison, and it was the brothers who had to manage his estate. But at about the same time, a top drug dealer from southwest Detroit named Leighton the Beast Simon was on the loose. He didn't like the fact that some underage amateurs were dealing in what he considered his territory, and so he declared war on the Flenory brothers. Leighton Simon had been dealing drugs since the late 70s. He started out as part of the gang of a man named Walter the Black Fox Kaysen. In a TV series about the Flenory brothers called Black Mafia Family, Leighton's character is renamed Lamar Silas and is the main protagonist of the entire first season. The war between the two had been hard fought. As a result of one failed assassination attempt, Terry Flenory nearly lost his right eye. However, in May 1988, shortly before Memorial Day, Leighton and his brother Elvis were shot in a restaurant. According to one source, they were killed by the Flenory brothers. According to another, it was the work of the Flenory's closest associates, the Valentino brothers. The Flenory's business gradually grew until 1988. Meech was arrested for possession of a bag of marijuana and illegal possession of a gun. Considering it was his first arrest, Meech only received probation. And in 1989, Demetrius decided to move from his native Detroit to Atlanta, Georgia. He was respected back home and had an established sales network there. but he realized that he and his business needed to grow. There was another reason for his departure. Layton's surviving supporters were not going to give up the market so easily, and periodically made attempts on the brothers' lives. For example, a year after the murder of Layton Simon, Meech miraculously survived a shootout in which he was shot 17 times. They had to leave, and choosing Atlanta was no accident. At least 3 freeways running from Atlanta allowed quick access to the east coast of the country, including one of Meech's favorite states, Florida. The region also caught attention because it bordered Alabama, Tennessee, Kentucky, and Missouri, states where cocaine trafficking was scarce in the late 80s, and that boded well for the brothers' business. Harold Mills, an old friend and mentor of the Flenory brothers, was still serving his time in prison, but he gave the brothers the contacts of his wholesale suppliers. After a while, not only did Mills' supply lines fall prey to the Flenorys, but also his wife, who became Terry Flenory's life partner. Meech was not happy with his brother's choice. He thought that Terry's wife was trying to push her man around and sticking her nose where it wasn't wanted. Terry, on the contrary, loved his wife very much, trusted her, and even tried to involve her in the discussion of important business decisions. Perhaps in those years between the brothers was their first serious conflict, which, for the time being, managed to stay quiet. Shortly after moving to Atlanta, Meech and Terry began looking for new suppliers and traveled to Los Angeles, where they met a guy named Wayne Joyner, nicknamed Waniac. He began supplying the brothers with first-class cocaine hydrochloride, which he himself obtained from Mexico, presumably from either El Chapo himself or Edgar Villarreal, a Texas native who later became a Mexican cocaine drug lord, also known by the nickname La Barbie. To handle these new larger shipments, the brothers would eventually have to create a network of several dozen couriers who would take shipments to buyers nearly all over America. The Flenorys bought goods through a variety of schemes. If they paid for the goods up front, the price of 1 kilogram was $14,000. The brothers also had a special system. They could get the goods first and pay for them later. In this case, the price of 1 kilogram could reach $16,000. Regardless of the type of payment, the brothers received cocaine hydrochloride, which then ended up in several laboratories they owned, first in Detroit and eventually in Atlanta. These labs were located in a variety of places: a cottage in an upscale suburb of Detroit, an unassuming apartment on the outskirts, and the main laboratory was located in the so-called White House, a luxurious mansion in Atlanta, which Meech had chosen for himself. In the hands of the lab workers was a kilo brick of goods. This brick was divided into 8 equal parts of 125 grams each. Then various chemical reagents were added to the 125 grams, and the whole mass was sent straight to a food processor, where it was thoroughly mixed. The resulting powder was carefully collected and put into a new mold. A 5-ton hydraulic press made a new brick out of it. So 7 bricks of cocaine hydrochloride, after all manipulations, turned into 8-kilo bricks each, of which contained the drug with a purity of almost 90%. The total volume of cocaine processed in the Flenory brothers' laboratories reached several hundred kilograms per month. It is not difficult to calculate that each ton generated another 150 kilos. Each kilogram was sold by the brothers for a profit of $3,000. If you add up all the profit received by the Flenorys, you get a sum of about $5 million per 1,000 kilograms. The drugs were transported in a variety of vehicles: cars, vans, and even limousines. One limousine could carry up to 200 kilos of cocaine. For this purpose, limos were equipped with special secret compartments isolated from the air. For example, in Navigator limousines, in order to gain access to the secret compartment, one needed to simultaneously press the emergency brake and open the sunroof. Such combinations were known only to the narrowest, most trusted circle of regular drivers. The drivers were paid generously. Depending on the duration of the trip, the driver's fee per ride could range from $8,000 to $25,000. In addition to transporting cocaine shipments from California to the labs, the drivers also delivered the already diluted product to all parts of America, New York, Missouri, Florida, Alabama, and more. On the way back, the same drivers carried cash, and despite the fact that a fully loaded limo could carry up to $9 million, such trips were paid much more modestly, only $1,000 per flight because of the lower risk. All markets were united by one thing: the brothers sold their goods only to proven big-time sellers, who then independently sold it to local dealers on the streets. In other words, the Flenory Brothers organization was largely a wholesale business, supplying retailers or smaller wholesalers. Evidence of the brothers' own retail network is vague. If there was one, it went no further than Detroit and Atlanta. Managing such a network was not easy, but the brothers managed to prove themselves true diplomats. The Flenorys decided to abandon the strategy of their predecessors, such as the Supreme Team organization, which was led by Kenneth McGriff, a native of Queens, New York, remembered for his cruelty. The brothers were more like CEOs of a large corporation, in which Meech was a magnanimous leader, a friendly and universally revered godfather. The dirty deeds were handled by his St. Louis deputy, Chad Brown, nicknamed J-Bo, derived from Junior Boss. He had a reputation for being an incredibly attentive businessman who could spot a couple $100 missing from a stack of several thousand. He was the one who ran things in Atlanta when Meech was out of town. Meech himself tried to stay away from the merchandise. He didn't touch drugs, didn't deal in cash, and never gave direct orders. That was J-Bo's job. Many rank-and-file members of the organization could only meet Meech at the parties he threw. In addition to J-Bo, the faction of Meech's organization also included Martez Tito Berth and Fleming Ill Daniels. Unlike Meech, Terry worked closely with the merchandise. He could be found in drug labs and often traveled to different states to meet couriers. But behind this workaholic facade was a calculative manipulator. Terry liked to offer some novice driver of the organization a more expensive and equipped car. After the newcomer gladly accepted the offer, Terry would force him to pay for the car by withholding monthly payments from his travel fees. Terry's right-hand man was Eric Slim Bivens. Terry lavished him with various expensive gifts, among which stood out a Bentley worth $200,000. Also in Terry's team included Derek Chip-Tooth Pegues, who oversaw his deals in Atlanta. William Turner, one of the managers responsible for processing cocaine from Mexico. Marlon Welch, son of Terry's wife from his first marriage, as well as Jerry J-Rock Davis. Not included in Terry's inner circle, but still trusted by him, was Terrence Short, a cousin of the Flenorys. The previously mentioned J-Rock introduced the Flenory brothers to William Doc Marshall, who would become one of the Flenorys' most important partners in the future. William, a lean and elegantly dressed man, a father of 12 children by the age of 30, was a premium automobile broker. He owned a company called Exquisite Empire. One of his main strengths as a salesman was that he had a knack for finding frontmen whose names he used to formalize the purchase of cars. So when Terry Flenory asked J-Rock if he had someone in mind who could help him buy a car, he said he did. Terry was interested in the stories about his companion, so he decided to meet William in person. At the meeting, Terry did not hide his true intentions and told Doc that he needed not just one, but a whole fleet of cars. So when Terry asked William if he could count on his exclusive cooperation, he said yes. If he had any doubts about the sincerity of Terry's intentions, they fell away after Flenory showed him some photos taken with P. Diddy. William soon began buying cars not only for Terry, but also for Meech's team. After a few years, his relationship with the Flenory brothers became very interesting. Over time, he began not only selling cars, but moving cocaine as well. And when William had to shut down his official business for a while, one of his cars was stopped by the cops with 12 kilos of coke on board. He moved on to a new job in the organization. He began serving as the brothers' CFO. In his new position, Doc was unleashed in all his glory. He was good with numbers and business papers, keeping track of how and what the Flenorys were spending their money on. William Marshall, who had graduated from college with a degree in accounting, found a host of ways the brothers could launder tens of millions of dollars. Through his extensive connections, he also began selling the brothers' cocaine to local drug dealers. In 1 month, William could sell 20 to 30 kilos of dope. For Marshall, as with all other members of the organization, the rules of the game were simple. No one outside the organization could know of its existence. If a gang member was arrested, he was to remain silent. The brothers condemned unnecessary violence because it drew undesired attention, and the Flenory brothers, especially Meech, valued personal loyalty. Many young fighters, in an effort to show their loyalty, were tattooed with the name of the gang BMF, or with its motto, Death Before Dishonor. The rapper Young Jeezy, who was in close contact with the Flenory brothers, would later name one of his tracks with this phrase. Meach studied the history of organized crime with interest. He was especially fascinated by the biographies of Meyer Lansky and Lucky Luciano, whose videos you can watch on our channel. Demetrius was obsessed with the idea of creating a dark-skinned crime family that resembled the Italian families. In a way, he made his dream come true. By 1996, at the organization's peak, the BMF had 24 branches across the United States. The BMF had offices in Los Angeles, New York, St. Louis, Louisville, Memphis, and Dallas. However, the organization's think tank and main production facilities were still located in Detroit and Atlanta. It was there that the goods came in from California and were then shipped across the country. It is noteworthy that their capture of such a huge drug market was completely bloodless. With an uninterrupted supply of drugs, the Flenory brothers could afford to sell at a lower price than their competitors. Before Meach Flenory came to Atlanta, the upper hand in the city's cocaine trade belonged to a gang called Miami Boys. But in the early 90s, that gang was defeated by the feds and a huge market was abandoned. Local dealers bought cocaine in different places, constantly clashing with each other over distribution territories and price levels. The Flenory brothers saw their window in the chaos of Atlanta's streets. Instead of subduing all the small-time drug dealers by fire and sword, as the Miami Boys had done before, the brothers took a business-minded approach. They simply met with Atlanta's biggest drug dealers and offered them a fair and lucrative deal: $17,000 per kilo of cocaine, better than the prices offered by the suppliers already in place. One of the most difficult tasks that the Flenory brothers had to solve was legalizing their money. Initially, the brothers had absolutely no legal source of income, and they did not file tax returns either. Terry Flenory proposed the following plan. One street cocaine dealer on his team knew the owner of a convenience store. At Terry's request, the store owner would set aside winning lottery tickets, usually ranging from $5,000 to $75,000. Terry would then purchase these tickets from the store owner. For example, for a $5,000 winning ticket, Terry would pay $5,250. These tickets were then cashed by Terry's wife or family members, most often her mother. Thus, over a period of several years, each of the women received between $30,000 and $100,000 a year. The tax authorities treated lottery winnings as legitimate income, and over time, BMF had people whose only job was buying lottery tickets. The brothers later used the money to buy themselves houses, cars, and jewelry. But it was impossible to launder all the money using the lottery scheme. Therefore, with the Doc's help, the Flenory family transferred money to the bank accounts of his acquaintances, those who had an official job and no past problems with the law. From these accounts, the brothers paid for real estate, and Meach paid the expenses of his record label and hip-hop magazine. The brothers spent part of their income on starting a legitimate business, in part to get legal jobs for members of their organization. Atlanta caught the brothers' attention for more than just the benefits to their business. The fact is that starting in the late 90s, Atlanta began to rapidly gain popularity in the hip-hop scene. The mid-90s was a time of new record labels, a phenomenon that allowed music to reach listeners within days of being written. Mixtape culture gave rap of the time a new immediacy. Artists could inform their fans about a beef with another rapper within days, rather than the months it usually took a big recording studio to record a new album. Demetrius watched all the commotion with interest. Meach decided that the best way to legalize his income would be through the music business. He decided to start his own hip-hop label. So starting in the early 2000s, he began looking for artists he thought had talent. Meach's logic was simple. If a musician was truly talented, he would be able to sell enough albums to not only legitimize the label's revenue, but also turn himself into a hip-hop legend of national stature. Demetrius even starred in a rap video in which he appeared as a drug lord. The video was directed by famed music videographer Benny Boom, and in addition to Meach, the clip also featured rappers Fabulous, E40, and BMF's protege, the young artist Blue Da Vinci. After filming downtown Atlanta from a helicopter, an elaborate choreographed scene, and invited guests, it all cost Meach about $500,000. Meach hoped that Blue Da Vinci's track We Still Here would be a breakout hit for his label, BMF Entertainment, so he spared no expense in promoting the music video. The track itself was recorded at Patchwork Studios in Atlanta, where such American showbiz icons as Whitney Houston, Britney Spears and Snoop Dogg had previously created their hits. When the track was ready, Meech organized several parties to celebrate its first audition. And during Blow Da Vinci's first live performance, young Jeezy was on stage with him. Meech himself was absent from this performance for a good reason. He was under house arrest for an incident outside the Chaos Club, which we'll talk about later. Those present at the show were reminded of this by J-Bo and Fleming Daniels, who wore Free Meech t-shirts for the occasion. Meech truly believed that the more money he spent on his passion project, the sooner he would be noticed in the hip-hop industry and the no-frills territory of show business. However, his bet on Blow Da Vinci did not pay off. The most expensive cars and state-of-the-art recording studios couldn't make up for a lack of talent. Da Vinci tried to be like gangsta artists such as Ice Cube, Snoop Dogg, and others, but frankly, his efforts looked weak. Despite his formidable exterior, Blow was never able to compose lyrics that would have brought him closer to the genre's top figures. Blow Da Vinci can be appropriately called a caricature of a hip-hop artist who did not possess the rare gift of poetic skill nor raw authenticity, unlike young Jeezy. Moving from his native Macon, Georgia to Atlanta at the age of 20, and without much money or patrons, Jeezy managed to blend into the local hip-hop crowd. He got acquainted with a local drug dealer named O-Dog, who later set him up with Meech. Flenory treated Jeezy well. He paid local club DJs to play his unreleased tracks and lent him cars and jewelry to shoot music videos. But young Jeezy never became a part of BMF Entertainment. By the time Meech launched his label in early 2004, the 26-year-old Jeezy was already running his own company, selling his mixtapes by the tens of thousands. And a year later, in 2005, Jeezy achieved his coveted goal by signing to the Def Jam label. In young Jeezy's very first music video, Over Here, you can see practically the entire top tier of BMF. Meech, Flenory, and J-Bo are among the guests at a party that Jeezy threw, according to the lyrics. Interestingly, when comparing this clip to Blow Da Vinci's efforts, critics noted that BMF Entertainment's product looked more polished and professionally done. However, the future has put things in perspective. As of 2024, young Jeezy's music video has garnered nearly 2 million views on YouTube. The Blow Da Vinci video, which cost Meech and company $500,000, has garnered only 78,000. And the most popular comment reads, "All the money in the world couldn't have saved this guy's career." However, Meech never got tired of reminding the public about himself. To do this, he placed an advertisement for his music label on several billboards along the highway that connected Atlanta to Detroit. Meech was inspired by Brian De Palma's movie Scarface, and while in the movie, Tony Montana looks up into the Miami sky and admires a blimp with the inscription, "The world belongs to you," flashing on its side. The people of Atlanta had to see the inscription, "The world belongs to BMF." Some researchers of BMF history consider this moment a turning point. Whereas law enforcement had previously brushed off rumors of an entire drug cartel at their doorstep. After such a defiant stunt, and some billboards were rumored to be visible even from the windows of the local DEA office, they took the Flenory brothers more seriously. However, such a narrative would not be entirely accurate. Although the DEA first noticed Meech back in the early 90s, for a long time the feds had no information about him. Agency investigators knew that the Flenory brothers' childhoods were spent in poor suburbs southwest of Detroit. So detectives suspected Meech and Terry's connection to Detroit drug dealers. Most of these dealers were part of the Puritan Avenue Boys, or PA Boys for short. The agents obtained permission to tap the telephone calls of some members of the organization. Overheard conversations and testimony from informants made it clear that although the Flenory brothers were not members of this gang, they did have their own distribution network. The agents became very interested in the murder of Dennis Kingsley Walker. One of the informants agreed to wear a recording device on his body, which the feds hoped would record enough information suitable for filing in court. The informant was able to make a recording on which a member of the BMF could be heard saying that Meech had shot Walker. The eldest Flenory brother became the prime suspect in the murder case, but that's where the investigation stalled. Despite their best efforts, the feds were unable to gather enough evidence to make an arrest. The murder in question took place in 1997. When Meech first arrived in Atlanta, there were already fellow Detroit residents there who were also involved in drug dealing. This relatively small gang was led by Dennis Kingsley Walker. He had moved from Detroit to Atlanta a few years earlier than Meech, And interestingly enough, he was accompanied by the recent Detroit companions of the Flenorys, the Valentino brothers. At first, Walker did not engage in illegal activities. But over time, he began dealing cocaine and was arrested by DEA agents in 1994. He pleaded guilty and also cut a deal with the feds in exchange for information about his associates. The Valentino brothers ended up receiving 15 years in prison each, while Walker only received 3 years. He was released on October 30th, 1997. On his first day on the outside, Walker went to a party celebrating his release, and after was driving a car to his home. Not far from Walker's house, at the Interstate 85 exit ramp, a car pulled up beside him. One of its windows rolled down and gunshots rang out. The former drug dealer died at the scene. Later, when the feds took over the case, some people close to BMF claimed that Meech was Walker's killer, but he was never formally charged. The fate most likely befell Walker because of his cooperation with the authorities. A year later, the agency was contacted by another informant. He identified Demetrius in one of the photos presented to him and told agents that the older Flenory always used different names. He had no real driver's license and always carried 2 guns and a huge amount of cash with him, despite having no place of employment. According to the informant, Meech was aware of the Drug Enforcement Administration's surveillance on him, but he didn't take it seriously, believing the feds had nothing on him. And at the very end of his story, he gave the name of a PA Boys member, Thelman T. Stuckey, who was associated with Meech, serving as indirect confirmation of Flenory's criminal activities. In the summer of 2001, the DEA learned that a man named Demetrius Flenory was living in a huge white house in an Atlanta suburb called Lithonia. Assistant local prosecutor Jack Harvey drove to the address and found a parking lot near the house filled with expensive cars. A year and a half later, agents were contacted by an informant who recorded a conversation that revealed that Meech was the man who shot Dennis Kingsley Walker. The informant gave the feds 2 pieces of good news at once. First, Meech was returning to Atlanta after leaving, and second, in honor of his birthday, he was going to throw a big party at his house. Meech had been away from Atlanta for several years. Information about where he was during that time is scarce. In 2003, Meech returned to Atlanta. He instantly became a welcome guest at all entertainment venues in the city except for one, the strip club K24, which he was forbidden to visit after a fight with a dancer. Now Meech always showed up at the club surrounded by an entourage dressed in black BMF t-shirts. In addition to the shirts, his team members also wore diamond medallions on platinum chains. Meech handed these ornaments to the most distinguished members of the organization. At first, the medallions were modest in size, approximately 2 by 3 centimeters. However, with time, and the increasing influence of the BMF, the size of the jewels increased. To make these medallions, the Flenory brothers hired one of the best jewelers in New York, Jacob Arabo, whose clients included such stars as Kanye West and David Beckham. Celebrities appreciated Jacob for his talent, and the Flenory brothers for the fact that he didn't mind paying them in cash. The next day, the informant told agents that he was able not only to get into the party, but also into Meech's private quarters. There, he said, a .45 caliber pistol was lying in plain sight in the master bedroom. Investigators speculated that the White House might not only have guns, but drugs as well. The feds checked databases and found that the house belonged to a woman named Tonisa Welch. Her name had already appeared in DEA reports. She was the wife of Meech's younger brother Terry. The same report stated that Tonisa did not live in Atlanta, but in Los Angeles, probably with Terry. It appeared that the house registered in Terry's girlfriend's name was where Meech lived all the time. The agents decided that all of this information was enough to get a search warrant for the mansion. In their application, the agents cited Meech's possible role in Walker's murder, his alleged connection to Thelman Stuckey, and even the gun in the bedroom. But the judge denied the warrant. The investigation was once again at a standstill. November 11th, 2003 did not foreshadow any trouble. That evening, Meech, along with his crew, went to Club Chaos to have a good time. Even though it was a Monday, the club was packed with people because at the time it was hosting a hip-hop night featuring some of the most talented performers from around the state. That same night, Anthony Jones, better known by his nickname Wolf, was also there. We have a separate video about him on our channel. Wolf was on friendly terms with Demetrius Flenory, and there are photos of the men standing with their arms on each other. However, things were different that night. It all started when Wolf saw his ex-girlfriend, and being in a drunken state, he expressed everything he thought about their past relationship. The girl by then was in the company of BMF guys, and Wolf didn't like that. He told her to get away from them, and when she refused, he grabbed her by the neck. This whole scene took place in front of Meech, who had to break them up. Wolf stepped aside, but an hour later he again tried to beat his ex. Here the club security intervened in what was happening, and they twisted and threw him out of the building. Demetrius and his guys smoked in the bar as if nothing had happened, leaving a huge amount of money. Meanwhile, Wolf, along with his friend Lamont Reese Gertie, waited for Meech outside his car. Around 4 a.m., the club was closing. The owner, Brian Alt, was happily counting the proceeds when one of the club's employees came running up and informed him that something terrible had happened in the parking lot near the establishment. Running out to the lot, the club owner saw Wolf bleeding and the body of Reese, who had already passed away. Soon police officers and an ambulance arrived. The paramedics immediately rushed Wolf to the hospital, but the surgeon's efforts were futile. He died a few minutes after arrival. Police officers were still combing the parking lot near Chaos when investigators got their first lead. It turned out that a woman had called 911 and said she knew the killer's name. She claimed she saw the man pull out a gun and then fire it at least 7 times. After those shots, the woman ran out of the parking lot, but managed to hear several more shots. According to her, the shooter's name was Demetrius. Hours later, detectives were told that 2 young black men went to a local hospital with gunshot wounds. One was shot in the leg and the other in the butt cheek. Officers picked the guys up from the hospital and took them to the police station, after which they were each questioned separately about their involvement in the Chaos parking lot murders. In the hands of police officers were 27-year-old Amin Bull Height and Demetrius Flenory. After questioning Height, who was shot in the leg, police decided to not charge him and released him soon after. Meech told police he had nothing to do with the murders and was wounded as he fled the parking lot. Investigators asked Flenory where he was staying, to which he replied that he was spending the night at his girlfriend's house. It was clear that the detainee was hiding his real residence. He didn't want anyone poking around his house. But now the agents had a much better chance of getting a search warrant. A few new items were added to the old application, and the judge gave the feds the long-awaited authorization. Demetrius was placed under house arrest by the judge. The search team arrived at Meech's mansion on November 17, 2003. The house was breathtaking in its splendor. It was decorated with marble in the range of $170,000, and the amount of expensive furniture surprised even agents that were used to such finds. But most of all, their attention was captured by the pictures on the walls. Among them were images of John Gotti, Tupac Shakur, and Notorious B.I.G. And the walls of the master bedroom were decorated with several photos of Tony Montana. However, the pictures could not be classified as evidence, but in the guest bedrooms were found 2 guns, several gold pendants forming the letters BMF, as well as a red notebook. It was this notebook that would become the officers' main reward for several years of work. The notebook was full of almost indecipherable writings that pertained to the payment of various bills. There were columns with headings like airline tickets, for car, owe money, paid money, cell phones, and things like that. According to lawmen, all of these entries were related to drug dealing. The entries in the notebook were carefully read by DEA agent Bryant Burns. He paid attention to names and nicknames, and some seemed familiar to Burns, such as the name Doc Marshall. In the months before the search of Demetrius Flenory's mansion, Burns had been working undercover, trying to infiltrate Marshall's crew. The work was hard, and with no results, but chance lent a helping hand. On the night of September 7, 2003, William Marshall called 911 himself to report that he had just shot and killed a burglar in his home. Police officers immediately arrived at the home, and in addition to the intruder's body, they noticed one other feature of Marshall's home interior. There was a safe the size of an entire room. At the time of the police visit, the safe was empty, but next to the body of the murdered man lay $450,000. Marshall couldn't explain to the cops how he got so much money. Burns obtained a search warrant for Marshall's residence and showed up the next day. Detectives seized several boxes of exquisite documents and reports, including the names and phone numbers of exquisite employees, as well as a list of cars that were used by frontmen to transfer the money to drug dealers. whose nicknames the meticulous marshal had carefully entered into his records. Now at the White House, Burns saw those same names as in the notebook he had found. Several of the cars and cell phones whose numbers were listed in Meech Flenory's red notebook were registered in the names of Exquisite employees. The connection between Exquisite and the Flenory brothers was too obvious to deny. Investigators soon discovered that the phone numbers recorded in Meech's notebook were being used to make regular calls to Detroit, to numbers that had long been tapped by DEA agents. Detroit cops were gathering evidence against the Puritan Avenue boys at the same time, and this information came in handy. 3 days after the White House search, 8 members of the PA boys, including the group's leaders, Reginald Dancy and Damone Brantley, were indicted on drug charges. The Flenorys could not be linked to this investigation in any way, but their apparent connection to the PA boys convinced DEA agents that the brothers were major traffickers. A joint photo of Demetrius Flenory and Brantley found in one of the rooms only confirmed this. A search of the White House exceeded police expectations, but no evidence was found to link the elder Flenory to the murders near Club Chaos. Ballistics experts determined that none of the 3 guns recovered from the house were the weapon of the crime, and 2 weeks after the search, Demetrius was out on bail. The murder case was falling apart. The killer's gun had not been found, and the prosecution's main witness, a woman on the phone with police officers, refused to give the cops her name because she feared for her life. Demetrius's lawyer said his client was not the killer, but the victim. According to his version, Flenory was leaving the club when he was shot at. Meech had to flee, which was confirmed by a wound to the butt. The murder investigation stalled, but the Flenory brothers' troubles continued. Spring of 2004 brought the brothers nothing but a slew of new problems. In late March, on a road in St. Louis, DEA officers pulled over a Lincoln limousine, a car mentioned in records found by the DEA 4 months earlier at the White House. The driver's name, Jabari Hayes, also appeared in those same Meech Flenory records. Agents brought in a dog that sniffed the interior of the limo. In a secret compartment behind the back seat, stacks of $100 bills worth more than $500,000 were found. Jabari managed to avoid major trouble with the law. He told agents that he was hauling the car at the request of a friend and that he was seeing the money for the first time in his life. The mere act of transporting such a large amount of cash, although suspicious, is not a crime, so Hayes was released. A few days later in Missouri, police arrested 2 men, Christopher Pig Triplett and Calvin Playboy Sparks. Triplett and Sparks were in a car, a Volvo C70, whose documents were also found in the White House. What's more, the detainees' nicknames were among 34 names listed in Demetrius Flenory's red notebook. Inside the Volvo, police found about 9 kilograms of cocaine. On April 11, 2004, Missouri State Highway Patrol stopped a van. The reason for the stop was a minor traffic violation. The driver was Jabari Hayes, the same driver who had been pulled over a few weeks earlier. He provided police officers with a driver's license issued in the name of Kenneth Torrey Collins. He got that license just 2 weeks before, shortly after he was pulled over by cops while driving another car. Noticing that the car had neither Georgia nor Texas license plates, the cops asked where Jabari had gotten the van. He replied that he had rented it in Orlando. But when asked by police why he had 3 work cell phones in the glove compartment, he couldn't answer. Jabari tried to turn it into a joke, saying it was so his many girlfriends wouldn't know each other existed. Then the police asked him a question head-on. Was he carrying anything illegal in his car? Jabari answered that he was not. Jabari had gotten out of trouble 3 weeks earlier, but now, sitting in the back of the patrol car, he realized he would not get off so easy. The cops called in a sniffer dog. It went around the van and started barking loudly. A few minutes later, the officers removed 3 suitcases containing more than 100 kilos of powder from the van. In interrogations, Jabari said he did not know how those suitcases ended up in his vehicle, but police learned that the van belonged to Orlando Exotic Car Rentals, whose owner, Mark Swift Whaley, provided the Flenory brothers with at least a dozen cars, including Meech's adored silver Lamborghini. These courier assets were far from the first in the gang's history. The Flenorys treated such incidents as a cost of doing business, but the fact that 3 movers had been locked up in such a short period of time was alarming. The brothers knew that Jabari would not talk in interrogations, but they were not so sure about Pig and Playboy. Adding fuel to the fire were Playboy's relatives, who believed Pig was working for the police. In a phone call with Terry, Playboy's brother Melvin said that during the preliminary hearing, Pig never looked him in the eye and rather lazily fought off the prosecutor's accusations. Terry was quick to reassure Melvin. He stated that Pig was an honest guy, and besides, the lawyer who represented him in court never worked with government witnesses. To finally alleviate Melvin's fears, Terry said that he was turning the phone over to his older brother. Meech reassured Melvin that everything was fine and promised him that very soon his brother would be exonerated and return home. Melvin had never spoken to or met Demetrius Flenory before, and if he had, he would have noticed that Meech's voice was different during the call. The thing is, by this point, Meech and Terry were barely speaking to each other, and it was Terry's close associate, Eric Slim Bivens, who was on the phone with Melvin. Terry resorted to his little trick for the sake of demonstrating to those around him that he was in control. The relationship between Terry and Meech was far from ideal by then. Terry believed that with his lifestyle and rash actions, such as shooting outside a nightclub, Meech put the entire organization at risk. Partying in nightclubs, posting up billboards, starring in music videos. All this irritated Terry, who was not keen on eccentricity and excessive attention. Subsequently, police informants said that in private conversations, Terry called Meech responsible for 100% of the organization's problems. However, Terry himself was far from blameless. A few months earlier, a judge had authorized the bugging of several phone numbers associated with a BMF faction in St. Louis. The feds discovered that one of those phones was making very frequent calls to a number that had a Detroit area code. It turned out that this number belonged to a longtime friend of Terry and Demetrius, Benjamin Blanco Johnson, who had been dealing cocaine with the brothers back when they lived in Detroit. After listening to Johnson's calls, agents were able to intercept one of Terry Flenory's 3 numbers. Although he never spoke directly about the drug trade, agents were able to figure out the inner workings of the gang. The younger Flenory used jargon that an outsider could understand if they wanted to. In phone conversations, Terry referred to cocaine as pants. They had their own designations for individual cities, Amir instead of Atlanta, for example, and the phrase, "pick up the mail," meant an order to move a sum of cash. Calls were recorded in which Terry reassured Playboy's family, bragged about buying a brand new $200,000 Bentley or $50,000 tickets to see his beloved Lakers play in the NBA draft. But the most valuable information the agents were able to glean was related to Meech. The cops realized why they couldn't pick up any of Terry's older brother's phone calls, not even the shortest ones. Whenever any of Terry's callers talked about his older brother, the younger Flenory didn't hesitate to speak up. Crazy bastard was one of the milder epithets that Terry awarded his sibling. The final break between the brothers occurred in the winter of 2004. Unusual for his style, Terry celebrated his 34th birthday in Las Vegas. For this, they rented a huge banquet hall in the Caesars Palace Casino. BMF groups from almost all over the country came to the celebration. Both the birthday boys and his brother's teams were in full attendance. Only one guest, Demetrius, was absent. He was unable to show up for his brother's birthday party due to some pressing business in Atlanta. However, Demetrius couldn't leave his brother without congratulating him, so he decided to do it via satellite. Demetrius's greeting lasted more than an hour and resembled a BMF Entertainment advertising campaign rather than a greeting from a loved one. Terry was under the impression that Demetrius had stolen his party from him. All of Terry's crewmates present at the event decided that Demetrius had done it on purpose, first by making everyone wait for his call and then by taking all the attention for himself. Terry's mood was ruined. The atmosphere at the party table deteriorated so much that by the end of the festivities, shooting almost broke out between Terry's and Demetrius's teams. It was prevented and the gang members dispersed to their hotel rooms, but Terry drew some conclusions for himself. After weeks against the Blow Da Vinci performance party, Meech was released from house arrest. The first thing he decided to do was to celebrate his 36th birthday. To do so, he rented the huge compound club on the outskirts of Atlanta, with an area of about 25,000 square meters. The club's courtyard was decorated with Meech in huge neon letters, and the BMF Entertainment emblem was carved into a massive block of ice. Demetrius wanted to recreate a scene from his favorite movie Scarface, in which Tony Montana takes his wedding guests to the backyard to show off his animals. The local zoo received several $100,000 and brought multiple tiger and lion enclosures to the club for one night. Meach continued to push his label hard while Terry watched this luxurious binge with clenched teeth. On July 24, 2004, Meach almost got into trouble again. Members of his team had a conflict with several visitors to the Velvet Room nightclub. At the height of the evening, several BMF members, including Fleming Daniels, decided to leave the establishment and head to the next club. The company piled into several expensive cars parked outside the club, but when Fleming's Porsche tried to drive off the sidewalk, it inadvertently hit a young guy named Rashanable Drummond, nicknamed Prince. Prince slammed his palm on the hood of the car, screaming as he nearly got run over by the wheels. Several guys jumped out of the car, including the driver. They all had half-empty Cristal champagne bottles in their hands. They first jumped on Prince and beat him up, then did the same to his crew, who tried to stand up for their comrade. Daniels thought that was not enough, so he took his Glock 40 caliber from the glove compartment of the car and shot several times at Rashanable, who was already lying on the ground without feeling. Meach was not involved in the conflict, mindful of his troubles with the law. Team members took him away from the club immediately after the shots were fired. Police arriving at the scene found 2 cell phones among the evidence, one of which appeared to belong to Duran D-Shot Hall, listed in DEA files as a member of the BMF. An ambulance arrived and took the victims to the hospital. Rashanable was dead by the time the paramedics arrived, and his friend was in a coma, which he was able to come out of only on the 8th day. Afterward, none of the participants in this fight against Rashanable wanted to cooperate with the authorities, motivated by their fear of the Flenory brothers. The appearance of those BMF billboard ads we talked about earlier really pissed off the authorities, especially Fulton County Assistant District Attorney Rand Teehee. He was one of the first to start gathering information on the Flenory brothers, but his superiors refused to believe that an entire crime syndicate existed and was successfully operating in Atlanta. Rand Teehee and Bryant Burns could imagine the extent of the Flenory's organization. They had a plan: catch a BMF member red-handed and turn him into an informant. They were confident that if they could trace the path of every dose of cocaine in the city, it would surely lead to Meach and Terry. The task, however, was not an easy one. For years, the police had made countless speculations about the BMF's involvement in the drug trade, but there was no hard evidence. Dealers, even those who were among the brothers' closest associates, suspected that their phone calls might be tapped. So they took countermeasures. They used special slang in their conversations, used cell phones registered in the names of strangers, and got rid of their phone at the first suspicion of surveillance. If the authorities were lucky and a dealer was caught with drugs, his associates at large quickly became aware of it. They tried not to do any business with such a person, and such an informant became useless, even if he agreed to cooperate with the authorities. But in the summer of 2004, the authorities managed to get on the trail of a man who could lead them to the Flenorys, Raphael Smurf Allison, a street-level crack dealer. The agents followed him for 3 years, starting in 2001. In July of 2004, they obtained a confidential informant who gained Raphael's favor by buying crack from him several times a month. Not wanting to lose such a lucrative client, Smurf even gave the informant his cell phone number so he could buy drugs whenever he wanted. The agents also had an idea of who Raphael's supplier might be. The surveillance team was able to follow the dealer as he replenished his supply of goods. At one gas station, the agents saw Smurf being handed a package by a man who'd arrived in a brown Pontiac. That car, agents later learned, belonged to a woman named Charmella Hoskins. Rand Teehee was able to get permission to tap Allison's phone. Now the feds had a new objective: get their informant to make a large purchase of crack cocaine from Raphael, then record the dealer's call to the supplier and get his phone number in the process. The informant met with Smurf and inquired about the possibility of buying 4 ounces of crack at once. He did not have that much product on him at the time, so he immediately contacted his supplier. The task force obtained the coveted phone number, which turned out to be registered in the same woman's name as the Pontiac. A few days later, officers working on Raphael's wiretaps heard that he was going to come to his supplier's house for a meeting. Agents from the surveillance team were able to covertly follow his car and obtain the purported address of the supplier. It turned out that Raphael was being supplied with drugs by Charmella Hoskins' husband, DeCarlo. The district judge authorized a wiretap on his phone number as well. Once the agents began listening to his conversations, they immediately noticed how openly and uninhibitedly he discussed his business. In one conversation, Hoskins complained about the quality of the goods he had received in a recent shipment, and 2 days later, agents learned that he was about to sell a large shipment. The feds tracked down the buyers and seized 7 kilos of cocaine from them. Now investigators had enough evidence to arrest not only Hoskins, but his supplier as well. DiCarlo lay low for a while. After 3 of his clients were arrested, he decided to give up his old number. However, agents were able to listen in on a conversation during which the cell phone carrier gave Hoskins his new digits. The agents began listening in on him as well. DiCarlo was nervous and trying to figure out why his clients were being tapped. In one of the phone conversations, the unlucky bargainer even seriously discussed getting rid of his phone, but it did not happen. Gradually, Hoskins calmed down, and in the fall of 2004, contacted one of his suppliers, Keith Patterson, to arrange the purchase of a handshake, 5 kilos of coke in slang. The agents grew animated. A few days later, they began tapping Keith's cell phone. They decided to arrest both drug dealers red-handed and try to induce them to cooperate. In early October 2004, the agents managed to find out the location of the deal. They decided to split it into 2 groups, one to follow Keith Patterson and the other to follow DiCarlo. The results of the operation exceeded their wildest expectations. In Keith's car, stopped on the highway, was found 4 kilograms of cocaine, and from the room where Patterson was waiting for Hoskins was seized another 6 kilos of coke and 30 kilos of marijuana. DiCarlo and Patterson were arrested. In the evening of the same day, a group of agents searched Hoskins' country home, as well as his mother's home, where they found $165,000 in cash. The drug dealer was facing a harsh sentence. However, the threat of jail time was not as frightening to him as the case against his wife, Sharmella. Hoskins immediately agreed to cooperate with the police. That same day, he gave the cops the names of all his suppliers. According to DiCarlo, they were from BMF, and never traded their product at any one particular location, instead preferring to distribute it to vetted vendors. The names of those vendors were Jeffrey Lear and Omari McCree. The agents ordered DiCarlo to contact one of them immediately. McCree could not be reached because he had, as it later turned out, gotten rid of his cell phone after suspecting a wiretap. Hoskins then contacted Jeff, who gave McCree's new number to him. The caller was contacted at the new number, but Omari replied that he would not discuss anything else over the phone. The feds began listening to Jeff and Omari's calls. It quickly became clear that when McCree said he would not discuss anything on the phone, he meant that he would not discuss anything with DiCarlo. Omari realized that Hoskins had been arrested, but wiring his conversations brought the agents quite a bit of information. On the first day of the wiretap, agents heard a conversation between Omari and Jeff, in which they discussed, albeit in the vaguest possible terms, a shooting at a nightclub the night before. Also on the phone call, Demetrius Flenory's name came up for the first time. McCree had been discussing with Jeffrey which car to use to pick up the gang leader from jail without drawing too much attention to himself. The fact is that shortly before the events described, on October 20th, 2004, at about 5 a.m., police officers stopped a Dodge Magnum near a nightclub. When the driver rolled down his side window, everyone around him smelled a strong odor of weed. In addition to the driver, there was one other passenger in the car, but both of them were arrested. The driver, Hamza Hewitt, who once worked as a bodyguard for Jeezy, was soon released. But the identity of the passenger aroused the officer's interest. When arrested, he gave his ID as Ricardo Santos, but the police station he gave a different name, Demetrius Flenory. Demetrius was taken to the police station, where he behaved in a rather defiant manner. Police records show that, while in his cell, he allowed himself to urinate on one of the walls. Meach had nothing to be charged with, so he got off with a few days in jail for a false ID and a fine for his antics in the cell. It became obvious that Omari was part of Meach's inner circle. From McCree's conversations, agents learned that rapper Young Jeezy was regularly late on payments for his Lamborghini, which he got from a dealership in Orlando. Agents also noticed that very often McCree was on the phone with Yogi, a woman in Meach's entourage who served as his secretary. Omari would sometimes share his worries with her about the nightclub shooting and Hoskins' possible cooperation with the feds. Yogi tried her best to reassure her companion. Agents decided to put the house he lived in under watch. They were counting on him to lead them to the house with a mysterious elevator they had heard about in his phone conversations, and which they rightly assumed was the BMF headquarters. However, Omari became suspicious. He began to worry about the possibility that the black truck parked on the curb near his house might be the cops. To clear the air, he called an acquaintance whose friend worked for the Atlanta Police Department. He gave her the truck's license plate number, which she then passed on to her friend. The agents realized there was a rat among the authorities. Going forward, they were unable to identify who. McCree was like a tennis player that loses a seemingly already won match. He started making unforced errors, fidgeting, doing what his emotions dictated rather than what was reasonable. When Jeffrey contacted him and offered to hide cocaine in his girlfriend's apartment, Omari agreed. The girl was in another city at the time, so the guys decided not to ask permission. When Courtney, Jeffrey's girlfriend, returned to Atlanta and found out what was stored in her apartment, she was outraged and demanded that the drugs be taken out immediately. Jeffrey's occupation was no secret to her, but such reckless behavior seemed unnecessary. Jeffrey reluctantly agreed to take the goods. Man and woman entered the apartment, took the bag, and then the couple got into the Porsche and headed toward the highway. Sehi decided that now was the best time to catch Jeffrey red-handed. Half an hour later, the police caught up with the Porsche near the center of town. Sehi personally supervised the arrest. Jeffrey and Courtney were handcuffed and placed in separate cars. In the backseat of the Porsche, agents found a gym bag filled with 10 kilos of white. Sehi was faced with his toughest choice. He had enough evidence that any jury would have found convincing to send Jeffrey, Courtney, and Omari to jail for decades. DeCarlo Hoskins was willing to confirm the identities of his suppliers in court, but Sehi decided to take his time. He believed that if McCree remained at large, he could lead investigators to one of the BMF executives, perhaps even Meach or Terry Flenory. And so instead of charging Omari and Jeffrey, Sehi decided to continue tapping their phone calls and let Jeffrey, who was in custody, go. Jeffrey Lear found himself in a dire situation. Having lost his cocaine, he found himself in debt to his boss, and he didn't have any drugs to sell in hopes of recouping the money he'd lost. Jeffrey talked to Omari on the phone from time to time, but those conversations were short and hard to understand. Therefore, on November 19, 2004, Sehi decided to visit Jeffrey at his home to discuss the likelihood of his impending arrest. At the time of Sehi's arrival, Omari was also in the house, and at the sight of the guests, he jumped off the balcony behind the house and ran away. Agents soon received authorization to tap 2 phone numbers belonging to Yogi, and once investigators had access to her calls, they began hearing from Meach on an almost daily basis. It turned out that Meach was aware that police were showing up at Jeff and Omari's home. Out of an abundance of caution, he decided to no longer store cocaine in the house they used to visit. One day, investigators finally got a hold of Demetrius Flenory's phone number. It would seem that the investigation was reaching the finish line. The head of the BMF was about to go on trial. However, the judges did not authorize the wiretapping of his phone. The Fulton County District Attorney's Office didn't want to prosecute Meach, Sehi said. The local agency decided to cede that right to the feds. At first glance, it might have seemed like all of the local police's efforts were in vain, but that wasn't the case. The feds had a lot more evidence, not only against Demetrius, but against his brother as well, so things moved faster. Omari McCree wasn't technically indicted, but he became a prime target. Wiretaps of his phone conversations suggested he was high up in the BMF hierarchy. As he was in debt to Meach Flenory, he mysteriously disappeared. But on June 8, 2005, he got identified on accident by a police officer. Omari McCree was arrested on the spot and within 2 hours was answering questions from investigators. Formally, he was charged with selling those 10 kilograms of cocaine that were found in Jeffrey Lear's car. Omari agreed to cooperate with the feds, confirmed his affiliation with the BMF, told them he had met with Meach and Terry Flenory, and, as a bonus, detailed to investigators the location of several mansions where the product was stored. A few days later, agents were conducting searches. On October 20, 2005, Demetrius Flenory was arrested at his mansion in suburban Dallas on a warrant issued a week earlier in Atlanta. By this point, the feds had amassed an impressive base of evidence and witness testimony. A week later, 15 BMF members, including Terry Flenory, were arrested in St. Louis. On October 28, 2005, a federal court in Detroit indicted the Flenory brothers. Meach was charged with 7 counts, and Terry with 9. In addition to the brothers, 23 of their accomplices were charged with lesser offenses, including Terry's longtime girlfriend, Tonisa Welch. Most of the defendants were part of Terry's crew. They were charged with the transportation and sale of cocaine. The indictment was 28 pages long, but it did not provide a complete picture of the organization. That document described 8 arrests of dealers in which over 500 kilos of white were seized. Not a single kilogram of cocaine was seized directly from Meach or Terry. The report said $3.9 million was seized, but according to the feds, that amount was scraps compared to what the brothers were earning. By conservative estimates, the Flenorys made nearly $270 million over 10 years. In recent years, Terry had often accused his brother of spending too much money and living an overly ostentatious lifestyle. However, the evidence in the indictment was much more against Terry. Although the brothers drove a Bentley, a Lamborghini, and a Maybach, these cars were not registered in their names. But Terry had purchased several expensive cars using a fake name, which the feds were able to uncover. Through his girlfriend, Terry was connected to 3 homes, the White House as well as 2 residences in California. According to the indictment, the titles to these homes belonged to Tonisa, who made $840,000 in mortgage payments in California over a 4-year period. Although Tonisa had her own business, a car dealership that the feds believed Terry used as a front, she did not earn enough to have fully covered those mortgage payments. The only asset linked to Meach on the indictment was a rented home in South Beach. But because the lease was not in Meach's name, it was difficult to prove that he was the one paying the $30,000 in monthly rent. The investigation had too little evidence against Meach and needed witnesses willing to testify against him. The difficulty with any BMF investigation was that everyone involved with the Flenory brothers remained silent. This was already the case from the investigation into the murders of Anthony Wolf Jones, Reese, and Rashanable Prince Drummond. But once a potential witness was indicted, they became more talkative. So the feds were relentless in reminding all concerned that cooperation would help them reduce a significant portion of their sentence. The investigation had high hopes for Omari McCree. 3 months before the arrest and indictment of the Flenory brothers, he managed to surprise investigators by pleading guilty. In his plea, Omari said he was part of Meach's cocaine network and regularly picked up dope at 2 of his residences. However, he did not reveal anything else. His attorney attempted to have his statement stricken from the record, attributing this behavior to the fear his client was experiencing. Testifying against Terry was Arnold Boyd, his former driver. At one time, 20 years prior, Benjamin Blanco Johnson was dealing cocaine for his older brother, which the Flenorys stored at their father's house. Boyd was aware of many aspects of Terry's activities, so after he was indicted, he made a plea deal. For cooperating with the government, his prison sentence was reduced from 12 to 8 years. Boyd told the feds about how he helped Terry move cash and drugs. He also gave valuable testimony about how cocaine hydrochloride was processed in the Detroit laboratories. But he only knew the most general and known facts about Meach. Prosecutors tried to convince the judge that Demetrius was a danger to the community and therefore should be held in custody without bail. DEA agents told the judges that more than 25 witnesses were interviewed, of which at least 10 pointed to the elder Flenory as a drug dealer. Demetrius's lifestyle was further described to the judges in great detail. The agent also remembered to tell the judges that Demetrius had not filed tax returns in years and had no recordable income. The judge heard 10 aliases, many of which had corresponding fake driver's licenses. Meach's attorneys tried to argue that the flamboyant lifestyle their client led was not in itself a crime. They cited that none of the witness statements specifically mentioned Demetrius Flenory's involvement in drug distribution. The judge heard both sides and denied the Flenory brothers bail. However, the biggest help to the investigation came from BMF's chief financial officer, William Marshall. He was facing a 20-year prison sentence, so he decided to cooperate with the feds. Marshall began talking 2 months after Meach's bail hearing. He told detectives he moved nearly 2,000 kilograms of cocaine over 3 years. Marshall described how in late 2003 and early 2004, he traveled to the White House once a week to pick up at least 10 kilos of coke. By that time, according to William, Terry had already wrested control of the house from Demetrius, who no longer had anything to do with the mansion. During visits to the house, William would usually pick up powder from one of Terry's top managers, Michael Freak Green or Slim, and sometimes from the homeowner himself. William told investigators how he helped Terry transfer his drug money to his girlfriend's accounts in a way that avoided detection by federal authorities. He also helped Terry find legitimate properties where the proceeds could be safely invested. William once even laundered the younger Flenory's money through a daycare center. Marshall did business with Meach too. He was probably the only person who brought the brothers together. Doc prepared spreadsheets for Demetrius that listed all his expenses for the month. The accountant did not forget to tell what he had seen inside the big Flenory's mansions. According to him, in one of the houses in the Atlanta suburbs, cocaine was stored in sports bags that were stacked under a pool table. Marshall mentioned that up to 200 kilos of cocaine could pass through one mansion in a week and a half. Thanks to Williams' testimony, Fleming Daniels was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Marshall told investigators that he was once present at an in-person meeting where Fleming received a kilo of dope to sell. At that time, Fleming was also charged with a murder he committed in July 2004. Daniels pleaded guilty. William gave investigators about 10 names of BMF members who had not yet been charged. In the following years, he appeared before juries and grand juries in Detroit, Orlando, and Nashville. As a result, he was sentenced to only 8 years in prison instead of 20. In July 2006, 16 more people were added to the indictment against the Flenory Brothers organization. The brothers were most surprised by the inclusion of their father, 58-year-old Charles Flenory, on the list. Demetrius believes that the feds were doing this to try to pressure them, since their father's crime was that he once handed an envelope of money to a contractor for repairs to a house. Neither the money nor the house itself belonged to Charles, and he himself received no benefit from the transaction. Perhaps by doing this, the feds wanted to get the brothers to confess to all the crimes themselves. However, they did not. Even while behind bars, Demetrius strained to keep up his style. While his lawyers were trying to combat hundreds of motions filed by federal prosecutors, Meach wanted to give a sign to everyone on the outside that the current turmoil wouldn't break him. The senior Flenory took an interest in BMF entertainment and tried to keep his music magazine, The Juice, afloat after 2 issues. Meach even started a MySpace page where he occasionally left pep talks for his supporters in and out of jail. While Demetrius was in prison, his music label was run by Blow. However, after the musician himself was charged with cocaine trafficking, the label was done away with. Strangely enough, Blow himself was happy about this turn of events. The thing is that, being on the outside, he had to face accusations that he was the one who turned Meach in. Now that he had been indicted, Blow defended his reputation on the streets of Atlanta. For a while after his arrest, he even tried to copy his patron's behavior, keeping quiet and saying nothing to investigators. But after 5 months in prison, he decided to give in. He told the feds that in addition to music, he had business interests in common with the Flenory brothers. He had moved cocaine several times. In November 2007, the trial began. Unlike Terry, Meach's phone number was not specifically tapped, nor was he arrested with a large amount of cash, or drugs for that matter. None of the witnesses, with the exception of William Marshall, could tell the court about any of Demetrius's illegal behavior. One of Meach's closest associates, J-Bo, refused to make a deal with the investigators. The feds were hoping that Terry, who at the time was facing life, would testify against his brother. Demetrius decided to plead guilty on his own. Doing so gave him a good chance of only 30 years in prison. It was a risk on Meach's part, but it was worth it. The older Flenory also thought Terry should do the same. A week before the trial began, Meach's attorneys asked the judge to allow the Flenory brothers to meet face-to-face. The judge agreed to the meeting, which was supposed to be the first for the brothers in almost 3 years. However, when the brothers found themselves in the same room, things did not go according to plan. According to eyewitnesses' recollections, shouts of profanity started coming from the meeting room. Apparently, Demetrius had overestimated his diplomatic skills. The next day, Terry appeared in court and told them he was not interested in pleading guilty. In the fall of 2008, the cases of all significant members of the BMF were tried. Those who cooperated with the investigation were able to have their prison sentences significantly reduced. The star of the BMF label, Blow Da Vinci, was sentenced to 5 years and 4 months. After his release in 2011, he resumed his music career and with his younger brother founded the BMF Swish Gang label. The Flenory brothers' father, Charles, was sentenced to a 3-year prison term for money laundering. Demetrius and Terry Flenory each received 30 years apiece. On May 5, 2020, Terry Flenory was released on house arrest due to health issues. The Federal Bureau of Prisons was releasing some inmates at the time to limit the spread of the coronavirus. Demetrius "Meech" Flenory also hoped to take advantage of this loophole, but was denied. The judge cited the fact that he violated prison rules by using a cell phone, as well as using drugs. At the time of our telling, however, Meech is expected to be released soon. In the meantime, Demetrius spends a lot of time talking to journalists and helping organized crime historians restore the true history of the BMF.